income inequality seems to be the worst. It seems to be worst in cities run by Democrats, governors of states run by Democrats, and countries currently run by Democrats.
Yeah!
So the thing is, let's look for root causes. But I would also lay some blame at the feet of the Federal Reserve. I think the Federal Reserve has made this problem worse. By artificially keeping interest rates below the market rate, average ordinary citizens have a tough time earning interest, have a tough time making money. They're actually talking now about negative interest. The money as it's created through quantitative easing or other means tends to start out in the big banks in New York. And because we're now paying interest for them to keep the money there, much of that money has not filtered out into the economy. So what we're finding is there is increasing income disparity and income inequality. We also find that as the Federal Reserve destroys the value of the currency, what you're finding is that if you're poor, if you make $20,000 a year and you have 3 or 4 kids and you're trying to get by, as your prices rise, or as the value of the dollar shrinks, these are the people that are hurt the worst. So really, we need to re-examine whether we want a Federal Reserve that's involved so much in determining interest rates. We also need to look at root causes as to what caused the housing boom and the housing collapse. But the bottom line is, if you want less income inequality, move to a city.
For that, it is not revenue neutral, and that's the idea. You want to choke off the amount of money coming into Washington. But don't you risk creating a near-term budget crisis, just as your presidency would be beginning?
Well, it's a great question, Neil, and thanks for including me in the tax debate. I think what's important about the tax debate is that we have to ask the question, where is money best spent? In the private sector and the government sector. I want a government really, really small. So small you can barely see it.
Yes.
So I want lower taxes and much more money in the private sector.
Yes.
My tax plan, however, is the only tax plan among any of the candidates on the stage that is part of a balanced budget plan. I put forward 3 plans that actually balance the budget over a 5-year period. Each of these plans have details on exactly where we cut. The question came up earlier, where would you cut? Nobody likes to say where they would cut. I put pencil to paper and done 3 budgets that actually balance. I'm also in favor of a plan called the penny plan, where we just cut 1% across the board, and that budget actually balances in less than 5 years. So I think what's extraordinary about my tax plan is it is in the context of balancing the budget. What's also extraordinary about my tax plan is it gets rid of the payroll tax. Democrats demagogue this issue to death. And when they do, they say, oh, a millionaire would get a bigger tax cut than someone making $10,000. That's proportionality, as Ben's trying to explain to folks. But the thing is if we get rid of the payroll tax, everybody's going to get a tax cut. And this is something that I think the public at large will support and could win an election.
There are no deductions on your plan?
Ours is 14.5% for corporations, 14.5% for individuals, no payroll tax for the employee, the business tax pays for Social Security, and there would be 2 remaining deductions, home mortgage and charity.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. What isn't conservative? Is it fiscally conservative to have $1 trillion expenditure? We're not talking about giving people back their tax money. He's talking about giving people money they didn't pay. It's a welfare transfer payment.
Thank you.
So here's what we have. Is it conservative to have $1 trillion in transfer payments, a new welfare program that's a refundable tax credit? Add that to Marco's plan for $1 trillion in new military spending, and you get something that looks to me not very conservative.
Excuse me, I get to respond. Very quickly, Senator. No, I get my 60 seconds to respond. Please. So let me begin with this. I actually believe, first of all, this is their money. They do pay. It is refundable, not just against the taxes they pay to the government, but also the tax on their federal income tax. It's refundable against the payroll tax. Everyone pays payroll tax. This is their money. This is not our money. And here's what I don't understand. If you invest that money in a piece of equipment, if you invest that money in a business, you get to write it off your taxes. But if you invest it in your children, in the future of America, and strengthening your family, we're not going to recognize that in our tax code. The family is the most important institution in society. And yes, I do want to rebuild the American military. I know that Rand is a committed isolationist. I'm not.
Answer, come on.
The United States is the strongest military power
conservative to add $1 trillion expenditure for the federal government that you're not paying for? How is it conservative to add $1 trillion in military expenditures? You cannot be a conservative if you're going to keep promoting new programs that you're not going to pay for.
Boom!
We can't even have an economy if we're not safe. There are radical jihadists in the Middle East beheading people
Under your bed.
Christians. A radical Shia cleric in Iran trying to get a nuclear
Let
weapon.
Randy sponsor. You should stop
taking
harming
over
them.
the South China Sea.
Come on, Randy's done.
The world is a safer. I know that the world is a safer and better place when America
Maybe we
is
should
the
stop
strongest
harming
military power.
We already are. We need to stop harming them. Come on, I'll say
I don't think we're any safer. I do not think we are any safer from bankruptcy court. As we go further and further into debt, we become less and less safe. This is the most important thing we're going to talk about tonight. Can you be a conservative and be liberal on military spending? Can you be for unlimited military spending and say, oh, I'm going to make the country safe? No, we need a safe country. But you know, we spend more on our military than the next 10 countries combined. I want a strong national defense, but I don't want us to be bankrupt.
Well, and that part of the problem, when I say, Senator, that if this deal is not ratified by the US, by the Senate, then it would actually give China an opportunity to grow its economic leadership, which it's been seeking to do. And if the US is unable to take part in this trade deal with these countries in Asia, China will take the lead.
There is an argument that China doesn't like the deal because in us doing the deal, we'll be trading with their competitors. You're exactly right. But I think we've sort of missed the point a little bit here. There is an important point, though, about how we discuss these trade treaties that I do agree with Mr. Trump on. We should negotiate from a position of strength, and we also should negotiate using the full force and the constitutional power that was given to us. I think it's a mistake that we give up power to the presidency on these trade deals. We give up the power to filibuster, and I'm kind of fond of that power. We give up the power to amend. And I think really one of the big problems we have in our country is over the last century, really, so much power has gravitated to the executive branch. Really, Congress is kind of a bystander. We don't write the rules, we don't make the laws, the executive branch does. So even in trade, and I am for trade, I think we should be careful about giving so much power to the presidency.
So that would be a mistake in not talking to Vladimir Putin or to rule it out. You argued that it's never a good idea to close down communication. With that in mind, do you think the same applies to administration efforts right now to include the Iranians in talks on Syria?
I'd like first to respond to the accusation. We should, I think it's particularly naive and particularly foolish to think that we're not going to talk to Russia. The idea of a no-fly zone, realize that this is also something Hillary Clinton agrees with several on our side with. You're asking for a no-fly zone in an area in which Russia already flies. Yes. Russia flies in that zone at the invitation of Iraq. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but you better know at least what we're getting into. So when you think it's going to be a good idea to have a no-fly zone of Iraq, realize that means you are saying we are going to shoot down Russian planes.
Yep.
If you're ready for that, be ready to send your sons and daughters to another war in Iraq. I don't want to see that happen. I think the first war in Iraq was a mistake. You can be strong without being involved in every civil war around the world.
How would you respond?
Ronald Reagan was strong, but Ronald Reagan didn't.
Ronald Reagan walked away at Reykjavik. He walked away, he quit talking when it was time to quit talking.
Why does she keep interrupting everybody?
Why the long face, Carly?
I'd like to finish my response, basically.
If I may respond,
This is an important question. This is an incredibly important question. And the question goes to be, who do we want to be our commander-in-chief? Do you want a commander-in-chief who says something that we never did throughout the entire Cold War, to discontinue having conversations with the Russians? I'm not happy about them flying over there, but I'm not naive enough to say, well, Iraq has them flying over their airspace, we're just going to announce that we're shooting them down. That is naive to the point of being something you might hear in junior high, but it's scary.
But if you're not going to respond in a no-fly zone strategy, what would yours be?
The first thing I would do is I wouldn't arm our enemies. I wouldn't arm.
Yes! You said it. Finally!
Most of the people who want the no-fly zone also favored arming the allies of Al-Qaeda, which became ISIS. That was the dumbest, most foolhardy notion, and most of the people up here supported it. They wanted to arm the allies of Al-Qaeda. Some of them still do. That's how ISIS grew. We pushed back Assad, and ISIS was allowed to grow in the vacuum. So the first thing you do is don't arm your enemies.
Well, that's right. I think I might just say it. So I need to add a couple points to this. The first is, I've never met Vladimir Putin, but I know enough about him to know he's a gangster. He's basically an organized crime figure that runs a country, controls a $2 trillion economy, and is using it to build up his military in a rapid way, despite the fact his economy is a disaster. He understands only geopolitical strength. And every time he has acted anywhere in the world, whether it's in Ukraine or Georgia before that, or now in the Middle East, it's because he is testing a weakness. His calculation in the Middle East is that he's seen what this president has done, which is nothing. The president has no strategy. Our allies in the region, democracy in the Middle East. It's the state of Israel. And we have a president that treats the prime minister of Israel with less respect than when he gives the Ayatollah in Iran. And so our allies in the region don't trust us. Vladimir Putin is exploiting that weakness for purposes of edging the Americans out as the most important geopolitical power broker in the region. And we do have a vested interest, and here's why. Because all those radical terrorist groups that, by the way, are not just in Syria and in Iraq. ISIS is now in Libya. They are a significant presence in Libya and in Afghanistan, and a growing presence in Pakistan. Soon they'll be in Turkey. They'll try to
policies that don't allow them to just enlarge themselves at the expense of smaller entities. And certainly some of the policies, some of the monetary and Fed policies that we're using makes it very easy for them. Makes it very easy for the big corporations, quite frankly, at these very low interest rates to buy back their stock and to drive the price of that up artificially. Those are the kinds of things that led to the problem in the first place. And I think this all really gets back to this whole regulation issue, which is creating a very abnormal situation. This country was declared its independence in 1776. In less than 100 years, it was the #1 economic power in the world. And the reason was because we had an atmosphere that
he's trying really hard.
Have been concerned about reining in Wall Street, apparently believing that some had not been punished enough. So as an accomplished litigator yourself and a former Solicitor General, would you go after the very people who believe and fear that Wall Street has ignored? In other words, the crooks, Goldman Sachs, Sanders say, have gotten away with a financial murder.
Absolutely, yes. You know, I've spent much of my adult life enforcing the law and defending the Constitution. And the problem that underlies all of this is the cronyism and corruption of Washington. You know, the opening question Jerry asked, would you bail out the big banks again? Nobody gave you an answer to that. I'll give you an answer. Absolutely not.
Except for Goldman Sachs.
What we have right now is we have Washington, as government gets bigger and bigger. You know, the biggest lie in all of Washington and in all of politics is that Republicans are the party of the rich. The truth is the rich do great with big government. They get in bed with big government. The big banks get bigger and bigger and bigger under Dodd-Frank, and community banks are going out of business. And by the way, the consequence of that is small businesses can't get business loans. And it is that fundamental corruption that is why 6 of the 10 wealthiest counties in America are in and around Washington, D.C. Now let me give you a contrast to Washington cronyism. Some weeks ago, a woman named Sabina Loving testified at a hearing that I chaired in the Senate. Sabina Loving is an African-American single mom who started a tax preparation business in the South Side.
We're on the brink.
Goldman Sachs.
Yes. Now, let's be clear. There is a role
What a
for the Federal
crock.
Reserve.
Ask him about Goldman Sachs.
What the Fed is doing now is it is a series of philosopher kings trying to guess what's happening with the economy. You look at the Fed, one of the reasons we had the financial crashes throughout the 2000s. We had loose money, we had an asset bubble that drove up the price of real estate, drove up the price of commodities, and then in the third quarter of 2008, the Fed tightened the money and crashed those asset prices, which caused a cascading collapse. That's why I am supporting getting back to rules-based monetary system, not with a bunch of philosopher kings deciding, but tied ideals
So
of
I
gold.
understand that. I just want to be clear, if you don't mind, that millions of depositors
Mitch is on it,
with that
everyone.
decision.
Well,
And I just
yes.
want to be clear, if it were to happen again,
Thanks, Dave.
for whatever the reason, that you would let it go. You would let a Bank of America go.
So let me be clear, I would not bail them out. But instead of adjusting monetary policy according to whims and getting it wrong over and over again and causing booms and busts, what the Fed should be doing is, number one, keeping our money tied to a stable level of gold, and number two, serving as a lender of last resort. That's what central banks do. So if you have a run on a bank, the Fed can serve as a lender of last resort, but it's not a bailout. It is a loan at higher interest rates. That's how central banks have worked, and I'll point out, look, we had a gold standard under Bretton Woods. We had it for about 170 years of our nation's history and enjoyed booming economic growth and lower inflation than we have had with the Fed now. We need to get back to sound money, which helps in particular working men and women. What Washington does, the people who are doing well in the Obama economy are those with power and influence in the Obama government. The people who are not Sabina Levy. What you just said, an executive knows to step in and bail out a bank.
They were talking about what you would do with depositors. Would you let these banks shut down? My argument is going forward, the banks have to reserve the capital so that the people who own the capital start pressuring the banks to not take these risky approaches, Ted. But at the end of the day,
you'd abandon philosophy and abandon principle, but what would you do if the bank was failing?
Because if during,
what would you do if the bank was
I would not let the people who put their money in there all go down.
So you would bail them out?
No, as an executive, I would figure out how to separate those people who can afford it versus those people who are the hard-working folks who put their money in those institutions. Let me say another thing.
You're too big to fail.
Here's what I mean by that. When you are faced in the last financial crisis with banks going under, and people who put their life savings in there, you got to deal with it. You can't turn a blind eye to it. Now going forward, that's one thing. If you had another financial crisis, perhaps there would be.
Banks have contributed to climate change. President Obama has announced an aggressive plan to cut carbon emissions. At the same time, energy production in America has boomed. Is it possible to continue this boom
and bring our energy that the president has put in place? Including the Clean Power Act. While I do think man may have a role in our climate, I think nature also has a role. The planet's 4.5 billion years old. We've been through geologic age after geologic age. We've had times when the temperature's been warmer. We've had times when the temperature's been colder. We've had times when the carbon in the atmosphere has been higher. So I think we need to look before we leap. President's often fond of saying he wants a balanced solution. But really, we do need to balance both keeping the environment clean. We will have some rules for that. We got to balance that with the economy. He's devastating my state. I say the president's not only destroying Kentucky, he's destroying the Democrat Party down there because nobody wants to associate with him. So what we really need is somebody that understands that we do need energy of all forms. And that means we will have solar and wind and hydro, but we will still have coal and we still will have natural gas. And we've got to have an all of the above policy. But it would be a mistake to shut down all of our industries in the coal fields and shut down the coal-powered plants. If we did so, we're going to have a day where we wake up and some of our big cities are either very cold or very hot. So I think it's a big danger and we shouldn't do it. And what we should do is say we want all of the above. We want to free up the energy sector and let people produce, let them drill, let them explore. Most humanitarian nation in the history of mankind. But we also borrow $1 million a minute. And the question I have for all Americans is think about it. Can you be a fiscal conservative if you don't conserve all of the money? If you're a profligate spender, you spend money in an unlimited fashion for the military, is that a conservative notion? We have to be conservative with all spending, domestic spending and welfare spending. I'm the only fiscal conservative on the stage.